Hi, folks. I'm Dan Dworkis, and this is the Emergency Mind podcast, a space where we bring together lessons from the emergency department and beyond about performing at our best when it matters the most and applying knowledge under pressure. The Emergency Mind podcast is brought to you by the folks at the Mission Critical Team Institute. If you want to find out more about what we're doing, you can find us at missioncti.com. Now, this episode is part 2 of a 2-part series of panels on team performance. It's a different set of individuals with different backgrounds and experiences on this panel, and they did not have access to the recording of the prior panel's conversation. So, apart from me, it's an independent set of people looking at the same problem from a different point of view. I hope you enjoy. All right, folks, thank you all so much for coming to this and for agreeing to participate in this, even though it might not exactly be clear what you're participating in. Our overall mission for this is to have a session where we talk about what it means to measure the performance of a team, and specifically a team that has to perform in and out of crisis. The origin of this is folks coming to us and saying, look, how do I know if my team is doing a good job? And if you've ever been leading a team that operates in and out of crisis, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that feeling of coming back from an operation or a mission or a shift and saying, I think things went well, but could they have gone better? How do I know? How do I help my team get better in the next wave of it? So I'm going to put a couple stakes in the ground about what we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to ask you all to introduce ourselves, and we're going to jump right in. And if you're listening to this later, this is the second panel out of 2, but nobody on this one has actually seen anything from the first one. So this is a really independent set, except of course for me. So a couple stakes in the ground to get us started. First, we're going to be talking about performance, not the outcome of what the team does. And to do this, we're going to lean heavily on Annie Duke's work, where we talk about outcome being what happened. Did the patient live or die? Or in her world, did they win or lose the hand of poker? Versus performance, which is, did the team do the best they could with what they have under their control? All right, so we're really going to focus there, not as much on the outcome, but more on the performance side of things. The second thing is we're going to be working with teams that move in and out of crisis. Okay, these teams might be temporary teams, they might be permanent teams, but in all cases, we're talking about groups that have to go back and forth between whatever normal looks like and really hairy, complicated, fast-moving spaces with life or death decisions. All right, so implicit in that is the concept that failure is going to be a large part of what we encounter. Right? That could be micro failure in the sense of we don't get a technique right, or it could be macro failure in the sense that the outcome is not what we might want it to be. But we have to think about how performance works in that world. So that said, I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves, and we're going to start from my top left. So Vinton, that's going to be you first, please.
Hey, I'm Vinton Bruton. I'm the director of the Wilson Center at Hampton-Sydney College. We're a small college, like under 1,000 students, all men. And I run our leadership development program within that. Just some experience in a variety of fields: wilderness education, classroom education, volunteer firefighting, military back in the day. So that's where I'm coming from.
Great. Thank you. Preston, we'll go to you next.
Preston Cline, CEO of Mission Critical Team Institute, just coming off the road after a long period of time. So psyched to be just at home. I can add to that if you want me to, but that's the main thing.
Awesome. Tom.
I'm Tom Seamands. I'm a senior principal at the McChrystal Group, consulting firm in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, I spent about 40 years in the military, retiring out of the Pentagon, working in HR.
Brilliant. And Dan.
Hi, everybody. My name's Dan House. I'm an emerge doc and intensivist. I spend most of my career doing clinical and research work in resuscitation beds.
Patrick.
Schouwenberg. I'm a surgeon intensivist. I'm based in the Netherlands and in Germany, so it's dark where I'm at now. I train medical mission critical teams, and I'm working on a program on teaching young doctors to have uncertainty tolerance. That's what I'm working on now.
Okay. Awesome. Scott.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Scott Tilton, I'm a nurse practitioner, adult cardiac surgery, critical care at the large academic center in Northeast in Philadelphia.
Great. Anne.
Hi, everyone. Annie, neonatologist, doing a lot around resuscitation in the NICU and in the delivery room space, also in the Northeast and academic center in Philadelphia.
But different ones. Excellent. Jay.
Good day, everyone. Jay Yellen. I'm a U.S. Navy trauma surgeon.
Brilliant. All right. So we have a huge diversity, and there's probably some people that are going to come in later as we get going, but we have a huge diversity of experience here, both in terms of the types of teams that we're working on and the history of the teams we've worked on before this, sort of the path we took to get to our current team. And my hope is that that diversity of experience will help inform this and help us create this collaborative definition of this. So before we start about how to measure team performance, I want to start us with a question one step back from that, which is actually, how do we define the performance of teams that work in this kind of space? And this is the first question that's open to the crew. And actually here, Andrew, welcome. You're just in time. Can you give everybody a one sentence on who you are? You just slotted in there perfectly.
My name's Andrew. I'm a emerge doc and a trauma doc at St. Mike, and time thinking about teams and team performance in the context of kind of space design, physical infrastructure, and systems. So,
gotta love it. Welcome to a panel. You jump right in and introduce yourself. It's strong work. All right. So the first question we're going to operate on is, how do we define the performance of the teams that we work on? And this is a bit of a subtle question because it's often a lot harder than it feels at the beginning of this. So I'm going to open this up to anybody who wants to get us started. How do you define the performance of a team that works in and out of crisis?
Yeah, I think for me, in this non-medical answer, ask yourself the question, your team the question, what is it you're trying to do? Because oftentimes I found in the military, oftentimes in the Pentagon, you start going down a azimuth and you think you're in the right direction, but you actually don't have an agreement. Coming to a common understanding what you want to do provides a common purpose and a shared consciousness of the team as they move forward, and allows you to synchronize everything else beyond that.
Great. So there's a concept of sort of performance in regards to what, or against what, or in what direction. We certainly see that in the emergency department. There's a pretty common thing you go through as your training, which is at first you're only concentrated on the person in front of you. And then you realize actually the job of the emergency department is the entire field of patients that you see and the ones that haven't even showed up yet. And if you switch your focus and switch your lens like that, then what success looks like or what performance looks like changes pretty dramatically. Really good. Dan, yeah, fire away.
Dan, can I just ask how married you are to the idea of completely uncoupling outcome and performance?
No, I'm not. That's just a stake in the ground to get us started.
Okay, great. Because I think along the same lines, I think what Ron was just describing, I think ultimately the success of the team in performing their goal ideally would be a really big part of it. I know I'm sure this is outside of medicine as well, but very often in crisis situations in medicine, there are many other things that play outside of how well the team performs. And I think that's what creates the challenge. Times when the team performance has a great percentage of the impact on outcome, achieving your goal, then I think that's the ideal metric. But I think so often in so many of the circumstances that we work in, the performance of the team is maybe 10%. You're getting that extra 10% from your team performance. And that's what makes it really challenging to evaluate those teams.
Yeah. Please just jump in whenever you want.
So I would just, to add to that, not to contradict it at all, but to add to that, because after looking at this for a long time, one of the interesting things they did at Wharton while I was there is they introduced a new metric that we would all use. And it simply was, if you were on a team, any team in the school, they would simply ask, would you work on this team again? And it was just a question, if given the choice, would you work on this team again? And the reason that matters is because it goes back to goals. If the goal is to fix one person, then that measures success in a very different way than I have to fix that one person every day for the next 2 years. Different person. So the question of performance on sustainability on longitude or performance one time. And so that's why the outcome then, if it becomes outcome centric, sometimes that will burn you through people. And then you will see other problems. That sometimes happens. So I'm trying to figure out in my mind how to square that. Because I'm not disagreeing. You can't kill the patient. So I'm not disagreeing at all. It's just I'm trying to figure out but we also know that more experienced people who stay on teams longer often perform better. So attrition can't be discounted. I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, the perfect Gaines point. And then in follow up on Preston's, the idea of in a cardiac arrest, the patient often, unfortunately, dies. By the time they get to the ED, the outcomes are poor, by and large. The team could hit a bunch of performance metrics that we would all consider excellent by AHA guidelines, standards in terms of CPR and all that. And yet the outcome that we really care about, which is patient survival in that particular instance, is going to be poor, negative, terrible. for everybody involved, but yet you can still be satisfied as a team. And so you can look, and I think I love Dan's idea of how much of a percent outcome is related to the team itself and how much is not, like how much are extraneous elements, and can you assign that probability or that percentage on the aggregate so people can know what impact they're having. And when you look at for example, a CPR situation, you might say that the performance was excellent, but obviously the outcome in the short term, one time is going to be bad. But if over time you sustain high metrics on these lateral surrogates, you're going to have more patients saved. And so two things can be true, I think, at the same time, the way they look at these.
Yeah. So Jay or Patrick, correct my numbers on this, right? But if you think about folks who come into the emergency department who have a blunt injury mechanism and get to a thoracotomy, right? These folks have survival rates that are like 1%, 2%, something like that. So there are these situations where we really need the entire team to come together to operate as one across disciplines and across professional domains. And yet we know the likely outcome of this most of the time is going to be death of the patient, right? So there's a sense of what the marker is we're looking at. And then there's, as Patrick and Preston are introducing, to connect to Dan's point here, like surrogate or proxy or lateral markers that are pieces along the way that we can point to and be like, okay, we think we should do this. Did we do this well? Did we do this well? And that's one answer to this, is that we can deconstruct the end outcome into steps and measure ourselves against that. And you looked like you had something that you wanted to jump in there with.
No, thanks. I totally agree with the comments around the outcomes. I think for us, it's very hard to use outcome as a performance of the team, because as everyone says, sometimes you have a great performing team or it feels like everything went well with the team performance, and the patient still dies not because of anything the team did. And so when I think about team performance, the neonatal resuscitation program, which I teach all the time, came up with these 10 key behavioral skills, whether you believe them or not. But I think it does get at what are the things that makes the team congeal well and work together to that common goal, knowing that goal shifts throughout a resuscitation or a crisis, right? Like sometimes it is to get the patient to have return of spontaneous circulation. Sometimes it is to have the patient have a peaceful death at the end. So I think it gets to those markers of what allows the team to gel together. And so when you do your brief, you don't have one person crying in the corner because someone yelled at them or because you could get a piece of equipment because it wasn't available. So I think it's hard to put it, to me, as you can tell from the way I'm talking, it's hard to put it into one like succinct sentence, because I think it involves a lot of different domains that makes it a definition of a well-performing team.
And I'm built on that. Like Anne, I've got a long list in front of me of what I think makes a great team in this environment. But if I had to boil it down to two things, it would be trust and the ability to adapt. So I think crisis is not predictable, so you have to be able to adapt to it. I think both those things are really hard to measure. Trust and adaptability.
Yeah, there's that old story of the drunk person looking for their keys under the streetlight, right? So they're looking for their keys under the streetlight, and somebody comes up and says, "Oh, can I help you?" "Oh, yeah, I lost my keys." And they look around for a while and they go, "Where'd you lose your keys?" "Oh, several blocks over that way." "Why are you looking here?" "Oh, because the light's here." Right? It's easy to look over here. And I think there's a sense sometimes that the proxy metrics we use are stuff we can measure because it's easier to measure. Like trust, adaptability, cohesion are hard to measure. Did we achieve a compression fraction of whatever percent is easier to measure, right? Did we get antibiotics into the patient within this amount of time is easier to measure. That doesn't make those metrics wrong. They can be super useful, but that maybe brings us to the second question of, okay, not that we've really nailed down what team performance is, but imagine for a second, we know what it is. How do we start to measure these things that are components of it that we believe, like trust and adaptability, but are maybe harder to get our hands around?
I was going to say that kind of going along with the rest of the group, a lot of the stuff that we're focused with in critical care is overturning staff and new people that are coming into the environment with little to no experience. We're asking them to do like extremely hard things. Mortality with ECMO or ECPR is extremely high. How do we keep them on target? And I think as far as measurement for me is like retention of staff, because we have a higher turnover of groups that we see people always leaving and, oh, we're giving a going away party for this person now. And it's how do we keep the staff on board and retain, and they keep coming back to the same sort of resuscitation, maybe different factors, but maybe feel safe psychologically to speak up and still operate in a very high performing way, but keep coming back, and maybe retention's maybe a way to measure it.
So if we continue to lose people because they hate working there, they hate doing the job, and they're burning out and leaving, that's a mark of a bad team. Right? Jay, you had something you wanted to jump in there with.
I was going to say, just getting back to your the first discussion is really the way I would measure performance is efficiency of mission accomplishment. So it has nothing to do with outcomes.
Okay.
So you look at efficiency of mission accomplishment, and and bring the efficiency part in, because you can accomplish your mission, and it was a disaster. So you really, I think, looking at team retention and whether you would work with a team, as Preston suggested, are all really downstream effects, and that you have to look for measurements of efficiency. And I know that's a broad statement, but that's how I envisioned whether a team is performing well. Over.
And can you press on that for us? How would you define mission accomplishment in this?
But obviously, it depends on the mission. So if it's a resuscitation team, it's getting to the end of that resuscitation, regardless of the outcome, whether they die or live or have complications. It's achieving that resuscitation. If it's special operations, inserting and getting a high value target, and it's getting that high value target. So I think each mission will depend on the definition of accomplishment, but I agree with you that will influence the efficiency part.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, Tom.
Does who's doing the measuring change the metrics? So if we see people around the operating room table have one point of view, the patient has a different point of view, the patient's family has a different point of view, the hospital may have a different point of view. Somebody who might benefit from a case study a year later, learning about things that could have gone differently, could have a different point of view. So for the discussion today, does it matter who we're asking, who's measuring the performance?
No, I think that's a great question. And I usually default to the operators who are doing the work, because I think that's where our center of gravity lies most of the time. But we know that only gets us so far. And the small team doing the work needs the larger superstructure around them to actually operate effectively and efficiently in order to allow them to do their precision work. So you're right that we have to balance, in some sense, maybe back to Jay's point, like, what does accomplishing the mission look like, or what is the efficiency of accomplishing the mission? If we torch everything around us at the same time, that has downfield consequences.
Sure.
So I think that's a great point. Yeah. Vinton, please.
I got me thinking about, I don't know if resilience or long-term, somehow those are connected, like not just the ability to accomplish the first mission, but the follow-ons. And yeah, like you might be really efficient in the first one, but burn it all down. And so you're not ready for round two. So somehow that's got to be measured.
There's a concept we see, and then Andrew, I'll go to you in a second. There's a concept we see a lot in training, again, younger doctors, where there's a difference between, do they believe the entire thing is this one patient, this one case in front of them, or do they realize that the way they interact with their team will create ripples through future resuscitations and future relationships, right? So getting them to transition their horizon or their field of view from a more finite game standpoint, where I have to win this engagement, whatever that means, to a more infinite viewpoint where this is one play among many that we're going to have together, is a really important piece in there. And one of the most common ways you see that point of friction is junior doctors and experienced nurses getting into fights, right? The experienced nurses who have been there, who have seen things, and a junior doctor who feels uncomfortable or insecure trying to steamroll over that person who has more experience. So can you reorient them towards what your future is? And a lot of what we're saying, just to thread this together, is defining the problem, right? We're saying, again, performance based on Tom's first comment, right? Performance as measured by what? What is our goal in this? And we're talking here about shifting our goal from an immediate focus to a much further horizon down. All right, Andrew, and then Anne.
And just to add, I guess, as we talk about measures, and I'm not sure really, I haven't really figured out a great way to combat this, but Goodhart's law, where when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. that should always be something that if our goal is, compression fractions or compression fraction, then over time, maybe that ends up being the goal and it's not actually achieving a better outcome for the patient, which I think most of us feel. Sometimes we just feel we know what the outcome should be, but as soon as you start to put it into words, I don't know what in physics, what was that?
Heisenberg's uncertainty principle.
Specify where you are, and then it suddenly is eluding you or elusive. So I don't know how to combat that. I think if I was to say like a portfolio of metrics and lag and lead indicators, some degree of rotation of those metrics, and emphasizing different types, not just obviously outcome like what we've been talking about, but behavioral measures. I don't know. So that there's some combination, but that we just aren't then playing the game to achieve the measure that we've put.
Yeah, perfect.
Great, thanks. Maybe because we're using the word measures here, it's making me think of a quality improvement project where you have your outcome that you want to achieve or decrease this by or improve this by whatever, but you have all these process measures that are in it. And I just feel like there's so many different domains here. It almost is right for thinking about what are the process measures that then would build into improving team performance. And then each of those you would almost can imagine would have different metrics. So whether it's some sort of video analysis, if you have videos that kind of measures the efficiency of movement or the time it takes to the team to achieve something, or whether it's a system that measures the communication and can look at what's like, where is communication lost or where is it suboptimal? And then, of course, in their surveys, however you want to do your surveys, I think you do have to survey everyone on the team, because I think sometimes one person or three people on the team think everything was great and they had great team performance, and the other three are like, that sucked. I never want to work with this team again. So I don't think I'm certainly not going to come up with an answer. And I think when you don't know what the goalpost is in terms of you want to improve team performance by how much, it's hard then to just use process measures. But that's like the way my mind is thinking when we're talking about this so far.
That's a great point. And that's something the first group, a direction the first group went into, which is the concept of what performance looks or feels like to you might not be the same as what performance looks or feels like to another point of view, whether that's somebody else on your team or, Tom, to your point, like another viewpoint that's not actually on your team in there. We started this conversation with the relatively simple, you're on a team and you come home at the end of the day and you're like, did my team do a good job? And that remains to some extent our center of gravity. But we realize that what my answer to that question is might not be the same as everybody else on that team to it. And that matters as well. So the other group went down this whole direction of one of the most important things being some version of accurate recording of what happened so that we can post hoc analyze it. That's a whole direction, whether that's video recording or audio recording or whatever it is, to think through it afterwards is an interesting tack.
To add to that, real quick, is that we're beating around the quantitative versus qualitative measurement stuff, and I'm not going to go down because that'll just be insane. But I will point out that you're referencing sort of narrative stuff. And so I'll just put in a plug for the fact that if you've been around teams long enough, you get a feeling when teams aren't working. You're not maybe ever, but if you trust anybody who's been doing this job for a while, they'll glance over and go, oh God, I got to move in that direction. And often it's the stories that are being told either by the team about the team or by other people about the team. And qualitative measurement, those narrative, you can actually measure that. That's a real thing that you can actually get a hold of and measure. It's a little tricky to do, but it can be done. And so I just don't want to discount. I don't want everything to go to ones and zeros, because I think we often miss a trick when we do that when it comes to teams, because there's something else going on. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And there's some great work from our colleagues in Australia who couldn't make this call time, who've done some really deep stuff around basically asking different departments in a hospital, what do you think of yourself and what do you think of the other people you work with? And looking at those reflexive webs and coming out with some interesting conversations like, why do we think that ER scores itself like this compared to surgery, and back and forth, and trying to put some structure around those things. Another way that we've certainly used for Mission Critical is simply asking, what are the stories you tell about your team? And are those stories helping you or hurting you? And really getting into the weeds about that. Anyone else on measuring stuff? Patrick, yeah, please. Oh, sorry, I didn't know.
I did look up 3 measuring scales, and we're not using any of them, but they all boil down to looking at leadership, like teamwork, and task management. So one of them is the team emergency assessment measure, so you can quantify. But then they test for leadership, teamwork, and task management. And what I also notice is that we should always be wary of measurement fatigue, doing so many measurements, quantifying so much that we just stop filling out the forms. It's because it's already very busy what we're doing, but I think it's really important. And I noticed that we're not actually quantifying what we're doing at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a tension in there that you and Preston are both hitting on, which is that if our real question is my team doing a good job, then some of the stuff towards answering that will be objective, measurable, comparable, and matrixable, for lack of a better word. And some of it will not. Some of it will not be easy to measure and will be more, not even qualitative, but more feel, more gestalt, and more downfield indicators. Are people leaving? Are they happy to be a part of the space that we're working in there? I think I interrupted somebody else. Yeah, Vinton, please.
I was just going to add, I'm interested in the part that's almost impossible to measure that you just referenced, but it's, does the team member wear their t-shirt off duty because they're proud to be part of the team? Do they have the team's tattoo? Are they identified with that team? Like, that stuff to me would be good indicators of this is a team that's got an identity and a culture and is proud of what they do. Because if they're no good, they're going to know they're no good and they're not going to wear a t-shirt out in town.
Yeah. And when we come back to that sense of, is my team doing a good job? I think implicit in what you're saying is that we want our team to be proud of the work that we do, separate from what our outcomes are, not entirely separate from what our outcomes are, related to our outcomes. But even when the outcomes are poor because the survival rate's 2% or whatever, we want our team to be proud of who we are and proud of what we're doing and feel like we are maybe operating at the edge of our capacity against this challenging problem. How do we measure some of that? Dan?
Just wondering if we're going to be looking at performance, it seems, particularly around the kinds of things that are being described right now, maybe we would want to differentiate between swarm teams and intact teams. And
Sure.
I probably would look at a different set of variables for swarm teams.
Yeah. If the team is temporary and flashes into existence and flashes back out, it's a little bit harder to make sense of what the team is and what performance looks like, because some of these things like team dynamic, membership, and do I believe I'm part of the team, you have to zoom out and say, I'm part of this hospital system, or I'm part of the greater field of neonatologists or ER doctors or whatever it is. So what's your center of gravity of belonging? Or do you feel like you're pushing things forward from that? I think great questions. I wasn't even going to go there in terms of temporary teams, but we certainly can.
I'll just throw it out that I would say that almost all the research written on teams is written for intact teams, and most of it is for temporally unconstrained teams. And so we're talking about, as Dan just pointed out, teams that operate under temporally constrained environments with criticality, and with some of them are technically not teams per se, the way they're defined in the literature, because they don't stay together. So they're actually a grouping rather than a team in the traditional sense. That isn't to suggest that they don't behave like a team. It's just that they're not as the research would define them as a team, which creates all sorts of problems when you're trying to understand how to make them better, because you're trying to borrow literature to do something when it was never designed to do it that way. Because for teams to happen, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a narrative, there's interdependence, there is a language, there's culture, right? In swarm teams, a lot of that doesn't exist. They might not even know each other's name. So it's a real question in the sense of, if we're going to measure a thing, we should also know what we're measuring and what we're calling it. And I know that's into the weeds a little bit, but I think for this purpose, it matters.
I think it's really hard because honestly, I don't know whether I would class myself in the teams I live in as intact or swarm, and they're a combination of both. And sometimes it's a swarm team because I don't know anyone and we're running up there. And sometimes we've had time to do good prep for the day and I know everyone on the team and I get up there. But it's a little bit for us, at least in the world I live in, it's hard to know, or I might run to a code where I know no one there, but I'm going to lead and I barely even know the patient, of course, since we have such a big unit here. So I think that's really hard. And back to Preston, I think the qualitative stuff can't be underestimated here. Like our qual work we did here in our SU team, whatever you call it, was like what we uncovered was like really quite important and relevant, I think, to how we think about ourselves as a team and what we need to do to improve our, I dare say, use the word culture because we use that in it. But then I also, the other thing is back to that audiovisual, I think it's really interesting. There's been some cool work done in the simulation world where they do spider webs, whatever they call it, for debriefings. They'll look at who's talking and when and how the flow of that conversation goes and tries to tie that to outcomes of learning from the simulation experience. And that's really cool. And you can imagine like maybe there are some stereotypical patterns of communication that happens that could also define a team. Granted, it's only one aspect, but those are the other things that from my other worlds.
In interviewing the folks that were around Moneyball, one of the really interesting things that came out of it is that there was a big movement when Moneyball came out to quantify baseball scouting, just to quantify it because they thought, oh, it's just a numbers game. Turns out that all that stuff that the scouts were talking about, a good percentage of them actually matters. And you can find it when you do the research, it will show up. So like body mechanics, they'll call it different stuff because they've been doing it 100 years. But like a guy that's been staring at nothing but baseball pitchers for 40 years, he knows some stuff. Might not be able to articulate it, but it's not true.
We're bumping here into the different types of spaces, and we're getting at the whole Kahneman Cline conversation about, is this a space where we can develop expertise or not? Right? Do we know what success or high performance looks like on some of these teams? Right? So we know what it looks like in baseball. We have metrics, but we also have a lot of time of understanding what a great baseball team is and what a bad baseball team is. Right? I think that's a little harder when we get into a lot of the team structures that we're talking about in here, because as Anne said, on a given day, I might operate on a swarm team, on an intact team, on a hybrid team, on a mix of teams, a team of teams. Tom, I'm looking at you with that one, right? And a bunch of other factors that might mean that I spend time across different domains. And what does success, what does high performance look like in those things is, I think, a very big, very open question that there's not a lot of space to. And if we don't have those answers, it's really hard to do what Preston's saying, which is to put expertise on top of that and say, you know what, that's what right looks like over there. Tom, you put something in the chat. I honestly don't know if the chat gets recorded for this thing or not. So can I ask you to surface whatever that was for all of us?
Sure. I was thinking about how you measure the outcomes. What I found in the Army, as well as doing consulting, is a lot of people are pretty good at measure or getting things right. But then if you ask the question, are you measuring the right things? It's a completely different question. And so oftentimes, especially when performance, this is outside the medical world, but people set the bar low and the goal and the expectation low. And if you go in and you say, okay, you are measuring X, what's your in order to, what's your purpose? And how does that tie back to your success? And those people actually find the right things to measure, have a higher probability of being successful than those who are, they're hitting 100% in everything, but what they're measuring doesn't really matter. Or maybe it not be the optimal things that are being measured.
I'm struck in this, how many of our conversations are circling around taking a step backward from proverbial coalface and looking at what do we think we're actually doing? What are we trying to do? What is the purpose of our team? And I think we see that in medicine when we face these 2% survival circumstances, right? What is our purpose in that room? As Jay put it, what does it mean to get through a resuscitation? And if we have that, and maybe we're saying teams that have that purpose and know that purpose and share that purpose can then figure out how to measure it and can then go forward to figure out what it looks like. It's a bit of a bold leap. I don't know, as you all hear that, how does that strike you?
Yeah, I like it too. I think the shared mental model leads to trust, leads to a better team dynamic, and leads to better, I'll call it outcomes, although I don't want to mix patient outcomes with outcomes of the team efficiency. So I think that this whole idea of a shared model, a mental model, a shared purpose goes a long way. So I'll give the example, when I was at the University of Pennsylvania with our Navy team, we worked together so much that we developed that shared mental model. And we can show through video review that our resuscitations were quieter and our time to operating room for penetrating trauma for hemorrhagic shock was much faster than the individual augmentee team that sort of, gets together just because they're on call, but we worked together for 3 years together.
Jay, can I ask you about that? So from the inside view, when you're on that team, when did you start feeling a difference compared to when did the data start showing you that there was a difference?
It took a while because, and it might be a peculiarity of a military team. Training levels are different. Expectations are a little bit different. As someone said, training to that lowest bar is common in the military. So we had to get everybody up to speed. So it probably took about a year.
Interesting. I'm curious about that because as we think about what our purpose is and how to measure performance, we're getting very quickly to this inside-outside view kind of dynamic where what does it feel like to me on the team? Do I know what it looks like versus what is the rest of the structure around me measuring, and how do we use that tension creatively? Let's go Andrew and then Vinton.
It's not exactly the answer to the question, Dan, so hopefully
That's okay.
it would be interesting to hear him say what he just described are pretty good surrogate markers for probably patient outcomes. If you get a hemorrhagic shock patient fast to the OR, like I'm going to bet money over time those patients do better. But so it's interesting. Is there a concept here that what they have in sports, we follow on the baseball analogy, like the wins above replacement, like there's probably a baseline amount of performance. And again, I don't have a definition. Clearly, obviously, a bunch of smart people here haven't been able to provide you with whatever that answer looks like, but with different perspectives. But this idea of wins above replacement, like you get pretty average people when they come together, there's probably a little bit of a complex system phenomenon. They get a little bit better because the sum of everybody together is a bit better than them on an individual level. But then you're at Jay's spot, and now you're even like better than that. You're the wins above replacement. It's like the expected value, which would be whatever it is, and then it can be an observed value. Like if we're looking about gambling, or not to derail us too far, but the way that you think about probabilities of an outcome. I don't know, it's just an interesting thing. I hadn't thought of it this way, but just as Jay was talking, it struck me as that's how we measure player success. Like how much better are they now than just the average player that we would have available to us on the team. I'm not sure how we build that in, but it's still difficult to think about because everybody's brought up amazing reasons of why you can't use a particular angle on how to define success in these contexts.
And that's fine. Like, I think getting to a place where we say, look, we don't know how to do X, but X would probably be important is a great place to take this group into. And I think, Andrew, to your point, and one of the advantages of what Jay's describing is that there's longevity of that team over time. And there are some places in medicine where that really does work like that, where it's not swarm teams, it's not temporary, it is the same team over time. And at that point, you can start doing some interesting stuff, right? You can start looking at how does the team performance differ compared to a regression to the mean model, where you'd expect if they do well one year, they do poorly the next year. But instead, if we're able to look at that over time, that's a great thing that when we do have the ability to use those resources, we should be using those resources. A lot of medicine, we can't. We don't have that ability to do it, but where it's there, we should do it. Let's go Vinton and then Scott.
I just typed mine into the chat because it was easier to get my thoughts together. But I think we're talking about team performance, but I do think there's this leadership trait where it's a skill set that people develop over time. The ability to like look at a team that just got thrown together, figure out what they're good at, and get them working together towards a challenging goal. I think that can be, if not taught, then learned. And I think it can be measured. And I think but I think it's not, I mean, it is related to team performance, but it's more focused on the leader. Do they even know to like do a quick survey of, let's say everybody's just in their street clothes and not in whatever their uniform is, and figure out, right, who knows how to do what? That's a good first step, things like that.
Yeah.
And not better in writing than verbally.
No, it's great. And I love that we're 45 minutes into a 1-hour session on team performance, and we have just said the word leadership for the first time. I think that's actually like really interesting and really telling. And obviously we all think leadership matters for team performance, but I think it's just to surface the unsaid thing here. We have all basically also said that it is one, but not the only component in team performance in this, which is really worth highlighting that structure. All right, Scott, and then I don't know, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, just to back up what Jay said is interesting is I brought this up at the summit with my group, was I was like, we have resuscitations. I had one like a month ago or 2 months ago where it was like, no one was talking during the case. And I feel like it was almost like you wanted this very structured, like who's in charge and announcements. And it was almost like this, like everyone was, it was a mastery. You realize it was almost like people were congealing as he was saying. And it was almost like everyone had assumptions of where everyone was going. And then in process, probably our outcomes were better and the team was better. And going forward, the care the team would be provided would be probably obsolete, or that would be your measurement mark. Because you always want to have this moment where you're like, okay, I'm the code team leader, but it was really like no one was talking. No one was just swimming and everyone was doing their own thing. We all were anticipating each other's moves. And maybe that's the measurement, is maybe quiet, as he said, but it was interesting. Because you want to have a moment where you're reflecting, like, why didn't we talk about during the case? But some of the loudest rooms are probably the more inefficient rooms, but it was interesting.
There's two things in there. One is the front-facing stuff of like how coherent is the team's mental model? And I don't really know how to answer that, but let's pretend you could for a second. You could stop time and ask people what you think is going on in this moment, or run them through a case and pause several times and be like, what do you think the problem is, and see how much they agree on what's happening to it. Our colleagues over at Wharton Neuroscience are doing some really interesting stuff with heartbeat synchrony and brainwave synchrony among teams as they sync up on the problem set. So there's some really interesting stuff we can do for that. But you actually just introduced a second metric of team performance, which is how good are we at learning from what just happened to inform tomorrow's work, right? Which is a separate skill from how good did we just do in this thing. And that's another dimension that I'd probably throw in there that we've put some threads around, but maybe haven't exactly connected. Preston, who was at first applauding and now raising his hand. Yes.
This is to show you how I don't know how to use these things.
It's perfect.
It's actually a question for Anne, and it's loaded, so Anne, you can wave me off. But it occurs to me that we're not talking about baseball teams, because I introduced baseball, right? And we're talking about teams that have to deal with very serious things. And so in Anne's case, you're going to have team members that are going to have to deal with kind of an ecosystem where there's going to be a regular death of a child, or irregular, or at least occasional, however you want to phrase that. And I would imagine that's a determinant. Like, that's going to be a thing that will screen people out, either because they think they can and can't, or because they choose not to at all. And I would think you would not be able to measure team performance without addressing some aspect of that. Am I off base on that?
I don't think you're totally off base. I think you're right of who decides to join the team, and people who decide to join the team potentially have a different set of skill sets than people who don't. For the team we have, where you can choose, at least within the microclimate, of course, who goes into the NICU, you've already self-selected to be a neonatologist, of course, or to be in any of our professions. So I think it's kind of a yes and answer, I think. Yeah, I don't know if I have a better answer. And back to thinking about the intact swarm and versus swarm or whatever, I still think that if you've been, in some respects, it shouldn't matter, right? If we've defined what it looks like for a well-performing team, then we should be able to teach to that. And it shouldn't matter whether you know the people on your team or you don't know, because you all should all know I'm this person on this team and we're on this team, and this is what contributes to team performance. So it shouldn't, in some respects, I think it shouldn't matter.
Yes.
I don't know. If I didn't answer your original question, sorry.
No, I think I guess my point being, you did a great job. My point being is that we have to be careful to not rely too much on like how they measure team performance at Wharton Business School students, because they're not doing what you guys are doing.
Oh, yes.
And so there's a reality that comes to that. What I would think must necessarily define that. However you would measure their performance, you'd have to consider that. And I think one of the things, Anne, that you pointed out made me suddenly realize I was writing down is, we should also be really thinking about task versus culture, not just outcome, but task versus culture, because a lot of times you all are talking about performance as per task rather than performance as per culture, which gets back to intact versus swarm.
Folks, to be mindful of our time here, what I'm going to do next is go around the horn and give everybody the chance to say one more thing. This thing can be whatever comment that you want to say about what we've talked about. Or it could be, if you're struggling to come up with one more thing, it could be an open question that we've surfaced that you think we should focus on next. All right, I'm going to go to Andrew first because he had his hand up in just a second. But to buffer for everybody, to give them another second, I want to put a reminder in here that everything we do on this, if you're listening to it, is to surface the best of what other folks already know about performing under pressure. Nothing that we're doing here is medical advice, and everybody is speaking on behalf only of themselves, not for any organization that they work for or with. Okay, so disclaimer said, Andrew, you want to start us off on our last rotation here?
Yeah, first of all, it's been great listening to everybody share pretty interesting ideas that I certainly don't know about, but it's amazing what happens when you get to have a conversation about this type of stuff. So thanks, Dan, for bringing us all together. One thing I guess I would add, or that I didn't hear a lot of, and we didn't go in that direction, would the other dimension of team performance is the physical environment that plays a role in that, like substantially. For example, I think it's James Clear that says the environment is the invisible hand that shapes human behavior. And you can imagine like a team, an F1 pit crew can take a tires on and off in 2 seconds. If you put them in my driveway, that same unbelievable world-class setting, world record-setting team would take a few minutes longer, I think, than 2 seconds. It would be not possible because of all of the other parts. We heard about Jay's team getting up to the OR so quickly. I bet you if you took the wheels off the stretcher, then that wouldn't happen so quickly. And so it is an element that we probably toggle back and forth between the environment and the team itself, and in terms of supporting its own performance. I'm not sure how that sort of fits in, but like you can't disregard that, particularly using like the F1 pit crew example. It's just impossible to deny the importance of the physical environment or the equipment, all of that to enhance.
No, perfect. And back to Tom's original question of like performance in regards to what? I think like the type of performance that you can muster at an ultra high powered academic medical center is going to look different than what you can do at a forward operating medical center versus a really tiny middle of nowhere critical access hospital. In part, Andrew, because of what you're pointing at, which is that performance is relative in some sense to the resources that you have available to perform with. Now, that's not entirely true. Dan said to some extent, it shouldn't matter who we're talking about or what we're doing. There are basic threads that go through everything, but you do have to think about the context of it. So thank you for that. Let's go Vinton next.
Yeah, if we're going to focus on one thing, it might be a debrief. So I think you can judge a team, like really good teams debrief well, because that's at least one way you get better. So I think if I were to try to measure something, that might be the thing I would try to measure, because I think that's an intersection between leadership and culture and adaptability and trust, for that matter.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll do Patrick and then Jay.
Really resonated with me was the thing that Vinton said earlier about, do you wear the t-shirt of your team outside of work? And then what I'm going to look at after this meeting is like more the meaning and identity and purpose and moral alignment of a team, how to measure that. I'm really fascinated by this intangible stuff. Do you want to be part of the team? Or like Preston said, would you work with this team again? That's talking about performance, and I'm really interested about measuring those things. Is this feeling of purpose, identity in the team? Yeah, so we'll look into that.
Love it. We'll do Jay and then Preston.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Thanks to everybody. It was a great conversation. I think the concept of culture is really important. And whether it's a sworn team or an intact team, the culture should overcome that. And I think a great example of that is the Marine Corps, right? The Marine Corps' culture is inculcated in every member, and it's pervasive in the organization. The organization is a learning organization. And even in ad hoc teams, they perform at a high level. So I think that's just an example of culture. And then just to follow up on Andrew's comment that the environment is really important. And I just think about kind and wicked learning environments and the impact that it has on our ability to make decisions. So I appreciate those comments. Thanks.
Love it. We'll do Preston and then Anne.
So I've been spending last year flying around the world working on selection assessment of a bunch of teams in military and tactical law enforcement. And I've become obsessed basically about this idea that a lot of our frameworks may be wrong in the following way, is that we are doing a really good job at creating people for a 4-year career that end up going on and committing suicide, getting divorced, having drug abuse, et cetera, and that we've got to start actually thinking about selecting and assessing people for their whole life and creating systems for their whole life. And so that we can create people that can be of service, not just to the team, but to their family and their community and to their life. And so I guess this brings me back to performance, which is I think we're often too short sighted on what we're thinking about as performance. And I think we do a better job on patients if we could find ways to create more sustainable teams, whether they be in or tactical forms. So the sustainability of it really is beginning to matter a great deal for me. And I defaulting to that. And I think from there comes outcomes. That's what I keep finding.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll do Anne and then Scott.
Thanks. I agree. This has been a great conversation. And I still keep going back to the kind of even the little small outcomes of a team versus how the team manages it. So like for me, it's the goal for a congenital diaphragmatic hernia baby in the delivery room is to intubate the patient as fast as possible. But sometimes that doesn't happen because you don't have the right equipment or the person doing it isn't as good. And to me, it's not the outcome of getting that intubation in the first minute is not what I care about. What I care about is how the team adopts. And so it gets a little bit about the adaptability piece of it. But how do you move forward and not let that then derail the whole rest of the resuscitation as a team? And I think the other thing, the other thing that the thread is bringing is when we talked about the trust piece is Anish Agarwal's work on hope, trust, and belonging with the blue coats, because I think that's also a thread that kind of pulls through all of this. And he certainly has done some things to try and measure that. But it gets to, I think, what a lot of people have said. Do you wear this when you go out? Are you hopeful the team has your back? Do you belong? Do you trust the team? Like, I think all of that is an interesting piece that started to resonate with me.
Thank you. Scott and then Tom.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. I think the things I took were the querying of the group or trying to figure out the mental models. Like, for instance, we have varying levels of engagement, whether it be or all levels of staff, nursing, maybe bedside techs or attendings and nurse practitioners or PAs. And I feel like they all have different levels of engagement. And how do I survey them through more qualitative ways and seeing like what their feelings are and what their mission is. The other thing I was thinking was, I think some of us are unicorns as far as thinking the way we think and how we act in a room. And how do we leverage or maximize the potential of people that maybe don't, because healthcare is like very complex and some people have different levels of engagement or what they want to do. So how do we like maximize their potential to get them operating on the same level that we are? Because we might not be able to get them to the point where we're so obsessed with it to a degree, but how do we leverage that, which is interesting, maybe a never ending problem, but I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Tom and then Dan.
Hey, Dan, thanks. Great discussion. Learned a lot. In the military, we sometimes talk about the boom and what happens to the left of the boom and the right of the boom. And so I think it'd be interesting for future discussion to talk about left of the boom. How do you set the conditions to have a highest possible probability of the outcome that you want, whether it's what Vinton talked about with the trust and adaptability, or I think Andrew talked about with the pit stop where everybody's syncing in terms of what they're doing. But what can you do beforehand to increase the chances of the outcome that you're looking for?
Yeah, and there's such a huge link in my mind between that concept to set the conditions and then let the team run, between that and what Anne was saying about, and really what Jay was saying too, about how any team, we should expect any team to be able to perform at this sort of space in there. And Scott Weingart from MCRIT, if you'll know him and follow his stuff, he and I had a great discussion / argument about that a couple of years ago, where he was like, we should build doctors that can work in any hospital. And I was like, we should build teams that can work with any doctor that you send them, right? Because in my mind, it's exactly what you all are saying, which is how do we set the initial conditions and then let the team have more likely success as they run forward with it. So thank you for bringing that up, Tom. Dan, we'll end with you, man.
Thank you, everybody. This has just been awesome. I guess I'm leaving this afternoon thinking about two things. The first is this juxtaposition still between outcome and performance. And I hate the idea of trying to use outcome to measure the performance of a team, but I worry that uncoupling them results in looking at a bunch of things that end up not being as important as we thought. And then the other thing that I was just thinking about, I jotted down a whole bunch of different potential performance indicators, and it seems like there's a lot of them, and then it would seem like it'd be too much to measure. I am left, though, with this reassuring feeling that I still feel like anytime I watch a team, I know whether they're good or not. And maybe I only know for myself, but I feel like there is anybody who has been in a space, whatever the space is, for a while, can see a team working well and knows what it looks like. And so I guess maybe a part of the challenge is just figuring out how do we tease out those things, going back to the baseball analogy, but also I think to what Jay said around efficiency. And if there was a sort of a single word about how you might describe that, it would be that sort of team efficiency.
I love it. I love it. Thank you all so much for jumping into this, for being a part of this, for sharing your expertise. I think it's always a wonderful thing to see folks from different countries, different walks of life, different professions come together in the common purpose of trying to make these elite and really important teams better. So thank you all so much for your time.